I'm Bethany Atkinson. I'm on a student placement with the Caldale Council for a year, and I've come here to Leeds Uni to find out more about flooding.
This conference is about the hydrology of uplands, but as an operational hydrologist dealing with flood, resource management and the protection of the environment, I have to say I'm much more interested in the hydrology from the uplands.
I'm Richard Maxted and I work as a leader of hydrology team for, that's 9 people, covering the Yorkshire and the North East.
22nd of June 2012, an enormous flood event. Water is running down the hillsides. It's bringing tons and tons of sediment and silt into the bottom of the Calder Valley. Houses on hills are flooding because water is coming in the back door and flowing through the house and coming out through the front door.
Our job is really the monitoring, the measurement, the analysis, the interpretation and providing information to the public about hydrology, so river flow, rainfall, river level, that kind of thing.
The uplands for the Environment Agency are not just about floods. We have 3 key responsibilities: the protection of life and property, sure enough that's about flooding, allocation of resources, and the enhancement and protection of the natural environment is a responsibility that we, the Environment Agency, and many others have. But of course, interestingly, in the upland, that natural environment in itself is a resource that requires allocation.
Every flood episode is very different. Rain, we live in a very thin, narrow, wet island set in a very large sea. And because we're so narrow, weather comes across our country very, very quickly. And therefore, the amount and the places where it hangs on for more than a fleeting moment differ every day, every hour of every day. So we've never seen 2 events that are the same. Even in 2012, where between June and July we had maybe 8 or 9 different flood events in Calderdale, so just in Hebden Bridge and Calderdale itself, every one of those events was actually caused by something different.
We treat the upland, I think, operationally, as a black box. We put rainfall in the top end, we parameterise it, and we get flow out of the back end of it. But I think one of the things that, looking at this slide, immediately made me think is, what on earth do we mean by upland? Calderdale is about 1,000 feet, 1,200 feet tops, which is not very high. Surely it has slopes that are nearly as vertiginous as anything you see in the Scottish Highlands, but for most of the uplands of the northeast of England, the tops are flat. They are not that dissimilar to Norfolk, they just sit at 1,000 feet. So what is it about our black box where we are trying to represent a whole bunch of different slopes, a whole bunch of different environments, not least an environment where people live?
The Calder is slightly unusual in the valleys are V-shaped, so they are very thin in the bottom and they are they're much wider at the top. When we're talking about the hydrology, the way runoff happens on a flat slope in the top, is quite different to the hydrology as it tumbles over the edge of something that's really quite steep. And then again the hydrology changes when it reaches the flat valley bottom, when all of that speed coming down the valley slope essentially has to go somewhere and it converts to depth. So we have these 3 different phases of hydrology which we have to somehow account for in terms of a way of mathematically modelling the change from rainfall across these different types of slope and of course different types of surface until we reach a flow figure that we can then move about to make a flood forecast and a flood warning.
One can hardly touch on reservoirs without mentioning a certain infamous drought of 1995. The blue line is the rate at which reservoirs fell and is still used as our type curve for the maximum speed with which reservoirs in Yorkshire can empty. It is the Bath plug. The red line is last year, and we still use the blue line as our first early warning that we need to phone Yorkshire Water pretty urgently.
So this is what makes forecasting floods so difficult, is that you're always trying to forecast the future on the basis of what happened in the past, where the past is never telling a consistent story.
We are under-resourced in knowledge gathering in the uplands. It is very hard to say to someone who needs a flood warning, I'm sorry, but that resource is going to be spent increasing our knowledge of the uplands, because it's a resource competition.
The problem with our weather is it's very dependent on the jet stream. And so in this country, it's inevitable that we see, and we have seen throughout history, clusters where we have periods of record events or very wet winters, or going back to the 1960s, a long period of very cold weather. And most of our flood events through the 1960s were caused by snowmelt. Most of our flood events in the 1970s were caused by summer storms. And in fact, most of the very large floods that we've had in this region have been the result of these convective summer storms. But we've, for instance, looked at the trend in rainfall at various sites across the region, and in some sites it's gradually been raining less, in other sites it's gradually been raining more, and in some places it's just doing what it always did.
Essentially, I'm looking at the impacts of reservoirs on downstream hydrology, so flooding, water quality, sediment transport, especially the coarse component, and benthic macroinvertebrates. So in addition to that, I'm also looking at the impact of modifying reservoir releases and seeing whether that has an impact on all of those facets as well. Every site is different, and because I've sort of really taken a sort of interdisciplinary approach, I've been able to kind of really home in on those really specific, complex relationships between, you know, things like hydrology, water quality, and biota as well. Typically, if you look at a reservoir and the stream immediately downstream of it, that stream is primarily sort of driven by disturbance events. So essentially that comes down to hydrology. So every time the reservoir overflows, you know, it could be seen as a significant event sort of biologically.
On the far right there's those metal plates that I installed on the bed of the river, and any time coarse sediment touches those plates, it records them, so that's really useful. And here this graph was produced from those, so along the bottom you've got discharge, and on the y-axis that's essentially coarse sediment transport in these streams. And the final was benthic macroinvertebrates. So once I realised what the impacts of reservoirs were, the second phase was to see what happens when we release some water from the reservoir. And that animation there is just showing you the sort of scale of these floods that we put in place.
The Woodland Trust are at this conference because we feel that there is so much benefit in trees and woodlands protecting the water environment and protecting other environments as well. So we recognise that trees have a role to play, and dare I say it, a rather cheap way of providing some engineering solutions. The natural engineering that will take place in the uplands by planting trees means that you can look after the water resource for the country. Obviously, our role as a charity is to increase woodland cover and bring woodlands into effective management. And we find it probably most challenging in the uplands for reasons of what happens with water in the uplands, the archaeology, and also the other aspects of the uplands that we want to look after, such as, you know, the bird species on there and retaining soil condition, etc. So it's getting the matrix right, and how the Woodland Trust are going to do that going into the future.
For small and moderate flood events, the fact that trees are drying the soil in between rainfall can reduce the runoff from forested areas. The drainage ditches in the traditional management used to speed it up as well. So, but then we come to these really massive rainfall events, and land use becomes less relevant then. It's really then the connectivity of the whole system, and the Upper Calder is a brilliant example of how runoff just occurs everywhere in these really big events, and it doesn't matter if it's Tesco's car park or a Forestry Commission plantation. Most sites are going to shed a lot of runoff. Our utilisation of the uplands has exposed more and more routes. I like to use the term connectivity, routes between where that raindrop falls and the nearest river. They require, as we're hearing at this conference, understanding of all those runoff processes, and I have to say that over the years I think I've been part of a move to identify and measure those processes. The danger is, I think now those historical results are being ignored or lost. I'll be speaking later about how we persuaded Forestry Commission to implement flood risk reduction measures in their land management, but they're a huge landowner. National Trust are also very good at this, but the implementation at individual small tenant farm, for example, level is much more difficult. The other thing I'd say is that Rivers Trust encourages scientific activity, even through its stakeholders, and our approach is to be on the ground where it's happening and to know the local deviations, if you like, from an otherwise national picture. We're the local people, and I think that's really important. Science in the community and emphasising that every patch of upland is different in terms of its rainfall and runoff.
Mr Monbiot claims that the awful flooding that we have recently suffered is the direct result of the activities of upland farmers and landowners. The overgrazing of sheep and the felling of trees to clear land for agriculture, all driven by EU subsidies. And I need to correct these fallacies. Overgrazing. This might be an issue in some areas, but it's very dangerous to generalise in this way. For example, in the North York Moors, the issue is undergrazing. The CLA is a membership organisation for farmers and landowners. We have about 3,500 members in the north of England, and my members own and look after about 60% of the land area. I think that the direct impacts of flooding for farmers and landowners are damage to their crops and loss of value to their land, and just the normal inconveniences of having your property flooded. I think that farmers and landowners are really happy to be working with everyone else to look for solutions as to how to deal with this. But actually, you've got to remember that they own the land for a purpose. They're managing the land as a business to make money. And so if we want to take land out of production to do something to sort of help stop the impact of floods, we need to find ways of making sure that they get some compensation for that. And as for clearing and felling trees, the moorlands were cleared many hundreds of years ago, and they're now managed as heather moorland for sheep grazing, grouse shooting, which is a major economic activity in many upland areas, and more recently for their international importance for nature conservation. But farmers and landowners can be part of the solution. Good work is already being done, and I expect that some of the other speakers will refer to them in more detail. Farmers, often working with river trusts and catchment-sensitive farming projects, are fencing off banks of rivers and streams. Tree planting is taking place in upland gills, with dual benefit for water and for black grouse habitat, and on marginal land on the moorland edge. My colleagues in Wales tell me about a project at Pont Bryn in mid-Wales where modelling work is being done on field scale and catchment scale land management interventions, such as field ponds, shelter belts and buffer strips. And more specifically for the audience here, I'd really like to see academics be more evangelical about their work.